Hello, everyone. My name is Ksenia Krasnova, and I'm an expert in urban strategic development and innovations for a built environment. And today we continue our series, Do Cities Dream of Electric People? The Evolving Values of Sustainability Enabled by Human Digital Interactions in the Built Environment. This series is dedicated to the innovations in the cities and for the cities and for the citizens. We discuss values and different objectives and challenges of integration of the innovations in built environment, as well as innovative approaches to analyzing and forming the cities and spaces that surround us. And we have already discussed the history of smart cities in the context of human-centered design. We have been to space and discussed space architecture and space innovations for our cities. We had a talk about neurodesign, about the connectivity of design and our perception of it. And you may check all these previous talks on YouTube. And today, I'm glad to introduce our very special guest, Dr. Anthony Vanky, an assistant professor at Columbia University from New York. And today, we will explore the topic, which is basically a foundation of the contemporary digitized cities. We know that we, as citizens, are generating and sharing data, leaving our digital footprints, which could help actually to form urban environment and analyze it. And create the better public spaces. So we will review this topic, discuss some interesting cases, overview the sensing technologies and other methods cities are using to collect data about the inhabitants. And of course, we will talk about some challenges and obstacles in terms of policies, technologies, social aspects associated with data-driven behavioral analysis in the cities. And yeah, we will end with the discussion of the perspectives of those approaches and what we should wait in the near future. So, and I will start by asking Anthony to introduce yourself and say a few words about yourself, how you started your career in this field, what inspired you, how you became involved in this field.
Great. Thank you, Ksenia, and to the American Center for having me. I'm really passionate about cities. If any of the people in the audience have ever met a New Yorker, we always love to brag about our city. So greetings to everyone from the great city of New York. Sometimes we say it is the ultimate city. Yeah, so we brag. We love the city, and I know many people have kind of imaginations of this incredible place. But I think deep in my heart, it is a love of cities. So to answer your question, well, let me say first, professionally and then the personal. I am an assistant professor here at Columbia University and the Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation, where I love this place because we think about architecture and the places in which we live, from everything from to steal an old quote from the Bauhaus, an old German school, from the spoon to the city, and as you were mentioning, also space. Thinking really about across all of these scales. And my work looks at the intersection between, digital technologies, all the new computation that we have, and the opportunities and challenges that come with it, in kind of so many ways, to the places in which we live, work, and play, the physical fabric of these urban spaces, these cities. But then also for me, really importantly, and I think when we get to the kind of the slides portion, really thinking about the role of people, right? Like, I don't think cities are just a place where we just happen to passively live. We inscribe our existence to the city, and the city responds to us, or we at least hope it does. Everything from participation in planting flowers to make better, more beautiful spaces, to how we use digital data to rethink infrastructure. And I got into the space, I'll say very honestly, I wanted to work with Disney, doing some of the theme parks, but through my own education, really thinking about not just kind of, a Disney World or kind of these fun places, but I think cities can be fun, and how we begin to, make them as livable spaces, as places that can spark joy and imagination that I think, you'll get to. But I started off in like really wanting to be an architect, and I've worked on a lot of really cool projects as a young architectural designer. But I was always interested in technology. Like, I mean, when I was in school, I think when I was graduating from my bachelor's degree, Second Life was just emerging, which I think for many people who are in the audience, and maybe yourself as well, you might have been too young for that. But another technology that was coming out, which we take for granted now, is YouTube. I remember seeing kind of events happening in Thailand, through YouTube before I was seeing it on kind of the news. So to see and to think about, well, if we always want to respond to people and to make better environments, well, the technology is changing the way we use the space and live through the space and understand the space. And that's where I kind of ended up in this really unique space between urbanism and urban design, but also the technology side and trying to understand places. But I think you'll also see a lot of like that creative, that want to be creative, that imagination that comes from architecture is still present, and constantly thinking about how else can we rethink technology. So that's, I think, how I got to this space. And I'm really honored to be invited to talk to folks
Oh,
about it.
thank you. Thank you for joining us. It's incredibly valuable. And yeah, I understand it totally. I share the passion towards the cities, so I can relate. And well, basically, each and every person, we are part of a city, whenever we like it or not. And
Yeah.
digital technologies also are, and we are building the perception through the digital technologies of each and every city and each and every movement in the city, within the city. And nowadays, it's approximately 4.4 billion inhabitants living in urban areas. And I'm sure our listeners, they know their cities, their towns, and they have ideas about how to improve those cities. So probably to start delving deeper into the topic, I propose to start with this discussion how urban designers, how they might think differently about the design of the public spaces in the cities in comparison with the residents. And probably you could name, in your opinion, what are the major, the core ideas well, in the field, and the core ideas in urban design nowadays.
Mhm. I'll say, I think this is a really interesting time, as you highlighted, and why, to your point, this is an incredibly important time to ask questions about our cities. It's only within past couple years, past decade, that we became an urban population, that more than half of all people on the face of the planet Earth live in cities, in regions, which drastically changes how we think about how we should design and approach them. Second to that, too, it's where a lot of our culture comes from, that they are incubators of ideas where people of different backgrounds and different stations in life and different jobs and different ideas come together. And sometimes, beautiful things happen, like jazz or rock and roll, right? That it is a mix of cultures that created that. But it also creates challenges of, where do we house everyone? How do we get people around? So kind of the big ideas that I think we have to think about, and that urban designers are now much more aware of, is cities are not removed from urban nature or from nature. We exist in ecosystems. So how do we build with nature? Especially when we see cities flooding, cities like Jakarta or New Orleans, have to deal with what? Venice, because water has always existed, whether we as urban, dwellers have believed so. Did we think we can control it? Now we realize we have to live with water, and we're working to adapt. We have to adapt to climate change, right? That the planet is changing, and for us to be able to live comfortably and equitably, we have to respond to that. Also, how do we get people around as more people come to cities? Where do we house people? And I think the paradigm for the past half century has been, well, we do it with cars, and we see the problems of Los Angeles exist in Beijing, exist in Bangkok, and having, been to Moscow also exists in Moscow, right? So, how do we begin to move people around more efficiently? And that's at the local scale of making walkable spaces to how do we think about public transit? Integrated with cars where we need it. That's how we get goods around in cities, and how do we tie that in with public transit? How do we adopt biking, which has been part of our culture since its invention, centuries ago, and then we kind of forgot about it. So I think we're now actually discovering all the old is good again. But how do we then really focus on livability? And it's
Yeah,
also, we also want them to be beautiful spaces too, no? Like,
of course. Yeah. Well, this is actually a very interesting question in terms of for how long we have been using different approaches towards urban design. And in general, what we're talking today and urban data, working with urban data, this area is common addressed as urban science. And
mhm,
the term is relatively new. It's basically 21st century term, but for sure, like since well, for sure, 20th century, we can remember urban dynamics by Forrester, or even earlier, like the famous John Snow mapping of cholera in 19th century, even Osman's renovation of Paris, which
mhm,
heavily relied on data. So the idea is not new in general. So what does it mean to have data-driven approach to urban design nowadays? How
mhm,
does this approach differ from traditional methods?
mhm. I mean, I think it's like multiple facets. I think one is the time in which we, can begin to do improvements. What are the feedback loops? And I'll talk a little bit about that later. But how do
Mm.
we think about how we respond? The idea that we are collecting data and about its inhabitants, although it has existed, has been a very difficult challenge. And for much of the 20th century, how we've done it was censuses, and maybe we do kind of sampling. But now with the
Mhm.
data that's being provided, we can do this at a massive scale. Like, we can begin to look at the city in its entirety. We can begin to, as I'll argue, maybe look at other ways we can view the city, because now we can think about, and I think where we move from maybe, urban analytics, which is maybe the reductive way, or urban dynamics, as a way of analytics towards urban science, I think is a big thing, is that we're also building theory like other scientists, right? In physics, you have kind of general, relativity as a theory. You have kind of gravitation and the math behind it. We can begin to build models about that in cities. But the coolest part, I think, is we can also validate our assumptions. We can go back and say, let's maybe collect more data, because we're leaving these digital breadcrumbs everywhere, through the pace of everyday life. And that actually allows us to maybe really create new ideas of how cities operate, in hopes that we can make them more livable, more just, more resilient, more beautiful, more livable spaces.
Sure, yeah. So this big amount of data, it sort of allowed us to have this more systematic and scientific approach, basically.
And it's
We
coming
would
from everywhere.
oh,
And I think
yeah,
that point is, this data is coming from everywhere, right? That is giving us many different lenses onto the city. So it's, I think you're right, systematic in one way, but I also think it's opportunistic in another. And that opportunism actually gives a lot of space for creativity as well.
true. Yeah, we're living in the era of digital economy too. So
Mhm.
there are lots of opportunities at the moment. And well, speaking about the variations of data and diversity of the resources, could you please name some examples? What types of data can be tracked, and how this data, well, maybe some specific examples would help our audience to understand how they contribute to understanding and understanding the cities, understanding the public spaces, and maybe you can just highlight some examples of analyzing data and some insights which helped to inform some decision-making process.
Yeah. And definitely, like, I have visual materials where we can talk about
Sure.
some of this a little
Yeah.
bit more too. So I won't give everything away, but I think it's also, the fact that we live with devices like this in our daily lives, whatever company you decide. I happen to have a Pixel phone. Um, a lot of you maybe Apple or Samsung or Huawei and all of that. But these devices, right, connect us to a world of information. And I think if we begin to think about this, right, on one level, this has to connect to a tower to make sure I get a signal. Well, the operators, are collecting data, not necessarily because they want to do crazy things, but in some cases, they just need to make sure that people can make phone calls or to send a text message, right? Operational data. They know how many people are pinging off a tower. Well, the tower is in a physical place. We can use that to now understand how many people are in an area. And maybe as devices move around, people moving from point A to point B. We can now instrument the urban environments, and many places are trying different things. Like we're using, we're putting cameras, we're putting sensors in roadbeds, we're putting Bluetooth sensors to measure. So people like to go, they put Bluetooth sensors so that they can measure how people move through. And now they're also doing it with Wi-Fi too, right? We can do cameras in the environment to measure what's the life of urban greenery. Are our trees doing well? Is the urban nature actually doing well? We're putting sound sensors, all of that. So, the cost is so low with some of these things. Not only are we carrying sensors, but, really the parts in this are cheap, and now instrument the city, as well, to begin to measure all different facets. And I think that's the amazing thing. And it's not just government or companies doing it, it's citizens doing it as well around things that they care about. In Barcelona, there's actually a powerful air quality network that residents have built, right? Because they care about the quality of the air that they're breathing. And I think that's the power that we're beginning to see and how this data is being collected. I'll also say surveys and people asking each other questions with pencil and paper is incredibly powerful too. Now that we can begin to, easily reach more people via social networks, to being outside of a metro stop, is also incredibly powerful data as well.
Oh, it is true, definitely. And also in recent years, while working with some urban strategic development project, I also used for sure lots of depersonalized big data, but also some surveys and traditional urban ethnography, but simultaneously with the urban digital ethnography nowadays.
Yeah.
It is
And it's
also
becoming so
important.
easy to do now too. And artificial intelligence is also potentially speeding up the process of everyday people to be able to do this analysis as well.
Yeah, this is true. But also, this leads me to the question how we actually empower, how you see the instruments to empower the citizens, how we can, well, transform them into active agent of collecting data, using this data. You made this example of Barcelona. Maybe you have some other examples or ideas, and how we can leverage the role of individual urban residents to capture their dynamics and their experiences in the cities.
Yeah. I mean, I'll say being a planner, this is a real secret for everyone. Sometimes, I've worked in government as well. The secret is we don't always know everything. We really try our best, right? Like we may have things that from, the elected officials or from, other ministries asking for certain things. And everyone is trying their best. But the reality is there's always resource constraints. There's only so many people with so much time. There's only 24 hours in a day. We can't ask every question. And I think the powerful part, and speaking from kind of the planning side, is that the technologies are allowing people to ask their own questions in some ways and reveal pictures that are incredibly powerful. And I talked about Barcelona, but I think a really kind of specific case that may highlight the power of this data is Japan after the Fukushima disaster with the nuclear reactor. I will say the Japanese government is incredibly adept and nimble and fast, but how do you respond to a disaster like that so quickly? They have a network of air quality sensors around that they've built for a variety of reasons, and many cities do around the world. We have these, but when you have disaster like that, they can't always get the measurements on the ground very quickly. So residents had questions. They're like, we don't know. So they were able to build their own sensors to measure, and actually they could see a very different map. And I don't think that that's like, oh, the government, in my honest opinion, I don't think the government was trying to hide, or, sometimes that we sometimes want to ascribe malice. I do think that they were trying their best, but we just don't have the capability sometimes. Sometimes residents can ask questions, their own questions, and deploy, faster. And we can talk about, okay, was the data fully validated, which is a question that we ask in science? Maybe not. But is that the point? And I think actually that gives agency for us to think about what are the questions that we want, right? Sometimes even in thinking about like measuring trees, there's a beautiful, I think, case in Melbourne, right? The city gave every tree an email address because then people could email saying they thought, actually, please tell us if the tree is not doing well or if it's needs water or something like that. But people actually, and I think many of the watchers and listeners probably can also resonate with this. We actually have an emotional connection with trees sometimes. And actually what happened was people started emailing poems to the trees or like love letters saying how much I love you. And that may seem silly, but actually that is a data set as well. That's collecting kind of the emotions that we have around, an urban amenity. But actually we have these personal relationships, and some cultures have kind of very strong connections to trees. But I think that, yes, we have serious data with what's the tree's condition, to maybe the poetic as well, which then as a data set, we can go back to the city and say, hey, actually, we love our trees. Maybe we want more. Or maybe, budgets are tight. Can we prioritize these trees, right? And I think that that's the power of thinking about what all types of data are. And I think to your work as well, you said both the qualitative and the quantitative, the computational and kind of the human. I think that these cases actually show the audit all together and posing different ways we look at the cities. Because sometimes, frankly, we don't know. Like, we don't know that you had an issue that this corner, that bus stop, there's always a trash can that falls over. There's some teenager on the block that knocks over the trash can that stops the bus from efficiently going to the bus stop. Sometimes we just don't know, right? But residents live that experience. So how does that information, that data come in at an aggregated scale, right? To make sure that you actually have a great commute to work. And we don't talk about, I think, customer service wise, we don't maybe talk about how much you enjoy your bus ride or your metro ride or your drive or your bike as much as we should. And I think that's the power of the data now.
It is true. Yeah, those are very valid examples. And it sort of reminds me about one of the questions from our listeners regarding how data helps us to understand the emotions of the citizens. So probably you partly have answered the question. So yeah, those examples are really interesting. And the power of crowdsourcing for sure. This is a key, and this is an opportunity we have at the moment as the citizens. Yeah, definitely.
And the two are related. I mean, and I think like the question of the environment and efficiency and all that are related to livability. If you build the greenest thing but no one uses it, then what's the point? We spend a lot of money, but we have to find the ways that are win-wins, right? And that we have to live with nature. We have to live sustainably. We have to figure out how to kind of reduce our impact, but also make it livable as well and joyful. And I think that's where the urban imagination comes in as well.
Yeah, I agree and understand that also the gamification, basically what we have in this example with the trees, which sort of helps to create the connection with the city, with the objects in the city to make them even more important. So these are the opportunities we have with the digital instruments. Maybe you can share some examples from your experience as a researcher, research lead at MIT Senseable City Lab, and maybe some current ongoing research at Columbia University.
Yeah.
It would be very
I
interesting.
don't know, like for AV, if this is a good time, I can jump into the slides. So maybe I have a lot of slides, but I'm not going to show them all. So I'll jump around very quickly to kind of maybe talk about a few of the projects that I think would be interesting for folks to maybe think about data in a different way. Right. And I want to start with maybe this kind of the idea of Holly White. And I think, Ksenia, your points about thinking about the computational and everything, I start here because he's my hero. So I didn't say this before, but Holly White, now we call him Holly White because of the H, because there's another William White who's also an anthropologist and sociologist. So he went by the H in his name. So Holly White, looked at public spaces through the technology of the 1960s, a camera and humans looking at this, analyzing how people use public space to create this documentation. I think that's powerful because it actually leads to real implications. So outside, not quite my window, but farther down, Bryant Park has actually been inscribed by his work. The movable chairs was because of his observations directly of how people want to use space. And I think now, like with the opportunities of technology, we can begin to do that more. So let me just talk about a few projects, big and small. So I'll go fairly quickly because I want to leave time for our conversation. So we had talked a little bit about understanding paths and kind of how people move around. And so I had done work in Saudi Arabia as part of the Senseable City Lab, where we were helping the city evaluate the plans that they had for the new metro. This was, I'll say, a couple of years ago. So the plans have changed quite a bit, but partially it was that they wanted to build a subway very quickly. And the planning office was like, okay, yeah, it's always, this is the problem sometimes, like the elected officials, are always like, we want it fast because, they want their name on it, but sometimes, we have to say, and the city was like hoping to say, all right, maybe we need to validate some of our assumptions. And this is, I think, to your point about the urban science of feedback. So we collected cell phone data to actually measure how people move through the city. And this is the first time this had been done in the case of Riyadh. Massive scale kind of analysis of point A to point B. But when you're going from point A to point B, that doesn't necessarily mean that's actually how people travel on the road. And for us to be able to plan a metro, we need to not only understand how people move macro, but also, is this true? Is this how people move on the roads? And we were able to validate this actually by saying, okay, based on how many people move from point A to point B, what are the likely paths they take? So we ran a massive simulation to do this so that we could, and we validated against actually real tried and true. We worked with the city. They provided road counts. They rushed out and did, road counts to see actually, can we prove this? So the sad thing is, when we did the analysis, and the city, I'll say, was great partners. They were helping us, and they had these suspicions. And we measured that based on the plan that they had. In the best case scenario, the subway would capture 0.05% of trips in this simulation. And the reason is, and it's about people. So we did surveys with the city, and it's because normally when we plan transit around the world, we say it's a 10-minute walking radius to the subway. But in Riyadh, it's hot. It's very hot, right? It's in the desert. People don't walk. And they said, actually, on average, maybe the longest walk we'll do is 200 meters.
10 minutes, it's a lot. Yeah, in this climate.
Yeah, so they're doing 5 minutes or shorter, 4 minutes. Right. So then working with the city, we can ask, okay, maybe these other scenarios, which is now something that they've really adopted. Maybe they do transit-oriented planning. So let's cluster around the mobility. Right? So now it's like, okay, we're getting to 5%. How do we do an intermodal system, which now we're getting to kind of the levels of usage that we see in other places in the world. So we're helping them think about, what the data can actually do, especially since shovels are in the ground. We're helping them think through these processes, right? And Riyadh is difficult because, and just seeing one of the questions, it's hard because it's an existing city with people living there. And one of the reasons, one of the recommendations we said was actually one of the things the rules of building a subway, you connect the universities and the airports to the tourist areas because tourists and students. But we also said you actually have a labor force, maybe connecting them in different ways, and now that's actually something that they've been implementing. But,
Mm-hmm.
you know, especially with new NEOM, you know, as a region and as a city, as a new process, many people are working, you know, and there are, you know, questions about how you make the city really function and how you use the state of the art. So there's a team. I'm recently, about 6 months ago, I met with the urban design and urban planning team, right? And they're actively thinking about and working with partners to say, how do we use these best practices, not just from the design side, you know, because the design has a certain characteristic, but how do we think about connectivity and
Mm-hmm.
using, you know, behavior? Like we have data on walking, so we know people don't walk that far because it's hot. How do we begin to implement these into simulation models, you know, to try to see how we really improve kind of the plans that they have? And it's a difficult challenge, right?
Oh,
You
yeah.
have so many different voices, and I tell my students, there's always three partners, three roughly groups that are always fighting: the citizens, the government, or those in power, and capital, and who's going to finance it. And you can usually only get 2 out of 3, right? But actually, in many cases, actually, if we can get a win-win and we can get all 3, that's incredibly powerful. So, you know, so I think it's for us to think about how do we find these win-wins, particularly in a case of like new cities.
Oh,
Let me
yes,
jump
it
to
is.
maybe, yeah.
Yeah.
Uh, uh, Let me jump to also a project to say, like, and I think applying to urban imagination, you know, what other data sets can we collect? Because this
This
is, I think, also
example,
talking. Sorry,
yeah,
go
this
ahead.
example with Riyadh is actually making me think about the contextual data, that it's very contextual, and it's
Yeah.
very important to, like, there are no universal models, basically. Well,
No.
some aspects they are, but still you have to be grounded and you have to know the specifics of the area and the habits of the inhabitants. And again, we have data to analyze this. And it's
Yeah.
some very simple examples, like in the countries with this climate, with the climate like in Riyadh, or for example, even Spain.
Hmm.
People, for example, tend to clusterize in the places where they have shading. And it is
Yes.
very obvious on the maps.
Yeah. And it's very difficult to measure microclimates. Like that scale. Like we can do things from a satellite. And you know, folks here, if you know, have some computer skills, you can access a lot, you know, NASA, for instance, has global satellite images that you could use. You know, they were originally made for agriculture, but people are using it, you know, and I had used the term opportunistically. People are using it as a way of measuring microclimates in cities. It wasn't made for that. It was made for agriculture, you know, but now we can actually begin to measure. But how do you measure your block? Well, people are putting out sensors to measure this. People
Mhm.
can now, as citizens, fill in the gaps because we don't necessarily always have the universal. We now have opportunities to kind of jump in at the fine grain and substitute it with new data. Can I talk about that very briefly?
Oh,
May I?
sure, sure.
I think also for those in the audience, a secret of these events: the moderator and the speaker usually talk beforehand. So this is actually, I think, a project that both Ksenia and I talk about a lot, and kind of a subject. But I want to bring this up as a way of talking about, you know, creating data. So, you know, when I was at MIT, one of the projects we did there was trash tag. Because there's something really interesting that happens is that when you think about the supply chain, we know everything about the supply chain, but we don't know anything about what happens when you throw something away. Right? And it's hard because data is lost in so many places. One, it goes into a truck or into pneumatic tubes underground, and who does it? In the United, we in many cities work with a company. So this one we worked with a company who did care, but they don't process everything. Electronics sometimes get given to a contractor who gives it to a subcontractor as we try to recycle and try to kind of, you know, make sure that we're not harming the planet. But at each point we lose data. So I'll hand it over to a video. If AV, you could play the first video, and I'll narrate over it if I can. So our project was to try to understand what happens with the removal chain. If we want to talk about urban sustainability, we have to understand what happens. And and we have tried to optimize the system. And here you're actually seeing the sorting facility outside of New York City. It's still actually globally still a very manual process because people do a better job at, frankly, getting all the recyclables. So for us to look at this picture, what we did was we had to create sensors. We created these tags, and then we partnered later with Qualcomm to hack kind of a device that they had. And we put this trash or these trackers into trash to see what happens. We had 500 volunteers from the city of Seattle, a very green city in the United States, who brought us 3,000 pieces of trash. They brought us everything from toys to shoes to a bagel and a banana. How we got a banana and a tag into it, that's another story. But it was real trash that people had, and we wanted to make sure that was representative. So then we went back, and then we watched the data talk to us. So at first, things went to places that we kind of expected. Local processing facilities for trash, recycling. Things were finding those efficient places. But as time went on, the map kept growing, to the point where after a month and 2 months, things were still moving across the country. The amazing thing is that no one had ever seen this picture before, nowhere, anywhere on the planet. And what we discovered was it's actually a lot of the new things that we have in life. You can see printer cartridges, electronics moving around the world, trying to find their most efficient place of rest. And if we can actually go back to the slides, I'll talk about some of the things that we found, right? As I said, things were trying to find the most efficient place. Like, people were trying their best, companies, government, and everything. But it's as we create new products, things just, we don't necessarily have those efficiencies there, especially with LED bulbs or electronics. So then actually something weird, we found that 2 printer cartridges, like an HP or, ones that you may have in your office or your home, both ended up in Baja California, in Mexico, under trade agreements. Trash moves actually freely through Canada, US, and Mexico. But they took very different routes. One went down the Pacific coast, one went to Minneapolis, to Chicago in the middle of the country, and then back to the West Coast. Because we have the GPS tracks, we could see that the shorter track, which we may think is efficient, went by truck. The long one went by train. The longer track actually has a smaller carbon footprint. So if we want to talk about sustainability, that poses really amazing questions about the infrastructure that I have with waste, right? And for waste management, I'll say, as our partners, they knew they weren't going to look great, right? But they stepped up and said, this is actually something that we care about. And the city of Seattle said, we care about, so we have to create the data. So they use kind of really creative and cool graduate students at MIT. And I'll say, like, to your question about things that we're doing at Columbia, last summer, we saw pictures like this. This is, from New York, of the orange skies. Unfortunately, for many places in the world, this is a common factor. Delhi has this very frequently, cities in China. And it's unfortunately a growing reality for many places around the world. But for me, the question has been, how do we measure the things we care about? Because we have these air quality sensors, and many people may have seen the news reports. Air quality is crazy. We know that, but the lived experience outside of these extremes, we don't always know. And what I mean by that is that we have kind of sensors in the sky that measure maybe urban city air quality, but not citizens' air quality.
Yeah.
So one of my students a few years ago, when New York City implemented a bus lane, so she, walked on the street, 14th Street, every day, and you could see just the congestion, the traffic of cars. And she's like, this can't be good for my health. But actually, the city then implemented bus-only access. So actually, during this, they changed the policies, and she actually measured that. Amazingly, it actually helped the folks who were on the ground with the air quality, because you didn't have cars idling with no impact to traffic. So I think she actually, in talking with her and thinking about this, we may be thinking about maybe not just about big data, but we could think about embodied data. What is the data that you get exposed to in places like New York? And I'll say this is a very personal project, is that I have asthma, and I've always wondered, what is my air quality, right? I may live in areas with better air quality. So we're actually instrumenting folks, and including myself. I will say I'm a research subject in that, where we're not just measuring, with an air quality sensor, we're actually measuring our biometrics. What is my heart rate? What is my friend's heart rate? What are our research subjects' heart rate?
Yes, exactly.
So we ran a quick pilot during the New York City Marathon. as we're going through the 5 boroughs. So I don't know if you can see, but the green line is the New York City Marathon. So we went through areas that we've traditionally known as bad air quality, but then we also went through other areas. This is also, I'll say, the best day for air quality in theory. Cars are off the road. It's a Sunday. It's the marathon. People are celebrating, all of these amazing things. But what we found was, and this is from the sensors that we found. So the darker kind of things at the bottom are from the official city measurement. So actually pretty good air quality. But if you actually take into account the activity and where people go, you just see the kind of the lines. That's the air quality, the PM 2.5 that people are breathing. All measurements that they breathed in was higher than the official city. And at no time was it actually ever healthy. So marathoning is an extreme. But this is a personal case because, and why we're doing it as a study. This was the case of 2. We're actually doing this kind of this summer with many more people across various neighborhoods. Because we're maybe thinking that actually we could move away from small data in the traditional way or big data in the traditional way. We actually want to get very essential to understand big data of a small population, because now we can draw a picture of people's lived experiences, how you experience a city, not how we broadly do it. And I think that personal look becomes incredibly important. So just to point out very quickly before, if we go back to conversation, I want to make sure we go back to conversation. My friend
from the audience.
My friend, has also been looking at this very similarly of measuring brainwave activity as people bike through the streets to actually create a cognitive map of how we use infrastructure, of the experience of everyday life. Her argument in traffic is that if you have higher kind of, mental activity, you have to concentrate more. It means the infrastructure isn't as good. But this is a brand new way of looking at the city, the affect of how you experience kind of urbanism. So maybe kind of go back to kind of other questions and comments, but I want to point out that we can also now produce data that we care about as well.
Yes, we can see the things from the inside, and this is amazing and extremely valuable. We can look at the cities in a different way and approach them differently and be concerned with our own well-being, basically, and focus on it more. So now we can measure it finally. So big data is not that scary. Yeah, it's actually could be very, very helpful. But this is actually a good point to sort of transition to the question. I had this question several times. Well, for sure through my career, and I'm sure through your career, you have lots of people asking you this question, and it sort of relates to the project you were describing. It's about the concerns about surveillance and about the general topic of the ethical aspects of data collecting. And I had several people asking me to talk to you about this, and they were asking questions that they were concerned about it. So those rightful concerns, and we know those may lead to major consequences, like even stopping some development processes and some projects. And so when implementing data-driven behavioral analysis in urban environment, what are the major concerns, and how we can, maybe you can just give some examples of how we can prevent and protect our data.
Yeah, I think the challenge is that. So let me say, my goal with teaching my students is we have to get past the hype. In that, a lot of people are trying to kind of sell a certain opinion of what the technology can do, and in some cases can't do, right? So I think that's the first thing. But I do think we are in the wild, wild west of what kind of these algorithms are able to do. So and one of the realities is because chatbot, the chat systems, the language models, they'll say, from everything from OpenAI, Meta to Google, these are the American companies, but the Chinese also have, many companies doing it, is that they're being trained with data that is easily accessible on the open internet. So if we think about, how these algorithms work is that they ingest a lot of data, and we have very fancy math that are trained on that data, and that we use that to then hopefully predict kind of new things. I think there are 2 points of the for us to be critical. One is, what's the data that's going in? How has it been trained? And why I mentioned the open internet is, if we were trained on the open internet, we don't talk natively and naturally, and it doesn't maybe reflect the everyday experiences, but that's the easy data that you can train on. So does that reflect reality? And then on the other side is, how are the algorithms running? And the very frank answer is, in many cases, we don't know. They are black boxes. We can see that they predict, but we don't know how it will respond. So, your question of, what are the other projects that we're doing, and to kind of answer this question in maybe the ways that I'm thinking about it is, in some cases, how do we make people care about the things that are not part of their lived experiences? So, for instance, if a new, migrant comes to the United States, how do they find resources? How do they find a community? How do they find, how to maybe get a job, or how do they, access language classes for their parents? The lived experience of how people do this is not documented well, and it's not certainly on the open internet. So my kind of work is that, how can we use these language models as an empathy engine? Can you talk to someone? But I want to do it not just like, I don't want you to just sit down and just ask questions of like a chatbot. No, I want it to be, going back to kind of the urban imagination, I want it to be an interactive real-time experience. One of the challenges that, okay, I can get a bunch of interviews, I can train the model and have it only know, we can set the technical term, the context window, to just that information. Okay, cool. But how does it know a story if I want to make it interactive? The algorithm doesn't know what the text actually means. It's a pattern recognizing thing. So then, if I actually want to have it work as an interactive story, and this is the technical challenge that we're working through, that's the difficulty. We don't really have the easy ways to do it. So how do we create an interactive experience when it doesn't know how to actually follow a story arc, or what these words that I've put in actually mean? It's really good pattern recognition. So then facial recognition, we've played with like all these kind of like social media apps where you can do filters for your face. It tends to be more successful on some faces than others. And specifically what I mean by that is those with darker skin tones tend to have less effectiveness with those tools. Why is actually the engineers, I think sometimes we give too much credit to them and say, oh, they're doing bad things. I don't know. I think that they're trying, but there are blind spots. So what was the data that they're training on? Things in the media. Well, if we actually go back to the photos that are in the media broadly, it's not just who's in it. It's actually that the companies that did it were actually training photo developers with the chemistry on the customer base. So broad-based camera technologies were made, much more available in the Western world. So people with fairer skin, they were calibrating based on their audience, their customer base, people with fairer skin. But then as the cameras became very diffuse globally, they didn't catch up. It was only in the 90s did, Kodak come out with a calibration system. So now we're ingesting all these videos into facial recognition systems. Of course, there's a blind spot. The data that was trained on is blind. So I think that that's the challenge. But these technologies, the same computer vision, the same AI, what we're doing at Columbia actually right now, as part of the Center for Smart Streetscapes, is we're actually using the same technologies despite being biased. We know that they have challenges, but we're actually using the ways that they do perform, and we're trying to create an assistive tool for people who are blind. How do you cross the street? So we're using, triangulation with phone. So that's all the sensors I was talking about before, with a camera system to say, oh, we see you, we will guide you. So maybe the light has turned green so you can cross, but a car decided to take a turn, a right turn, against the light. Well, we can warn you. So we know that there are challenges, but we can also opportunistically look at that to kind of then say, there's still opportunities. We have to think about the technologies much more broadly to solve real problems. And I think that's where we as citizens haven't caught up. We're still so excited about the fun things. I think many of us are still catching up in the real applications to improve people's lives. And for a person who can't see, who has a walking stick, to help them cross the street safely or find that business, or maybe they drop something. We haven't actually worked on this part, right? But what if they drop something? We could say, we noticed that something fell, turn 5 meters to the left, walk 10 degrees, walk 10 meters, 10 degrees to your left, and maybe pick up your wallet, or avoid a bike that's coming down. You're veering off the crosswalk, turn 5 degrees to your right. And that's what the technology can do. We just have to make sure that we're using the tools to push that vision.
Yeah, and this personalization, again, with the development of the technologies, with the processing capacity development, it's also very important. That it seems like it sort of also leads us to the next question, where we are heading in terms of data-informed approach. And what do you see in the near future, how those technologies will develop? And well, maybe some visions you have of the nearest future, and how those technologies will help people within the cities. Well, you partly answered this question while answering the previous question, but still, maybe some insights.
Yeah, but I think, one of the challenges that we're still trying to figure things out. And I think the problem is that we are testing them in the real world. I also wonder, so this is me just now thinking out loud. One of my worries is also too, like, how often has your phone gotten really slow with the new updates, with the new software updates? So you have to get a new phone, at some point, or a new, whatever, all the devices, your, TVs, or, hopefully not your car or your refrigerator or something like that. But, we have devices that get outdated. But what happens when it's actually part of the city? I think we will see a lot of retrofit as cities, older cities that have been around for millennia. They constantly re-evolve, like a city like New York. They're trying to put in technologies to get cars to make the subways move, much like in Moscow or Tokyo or Beijing. But that's where we'll see it fast. I don't think we have figured it out about the long-term kind of aspects of how do we ensure space is responsive to you to make sure that it's livable. We can document it and then come up with a paper report or PDF report, as we've always done. But I think that is kind of the space where I think we're still trying to figure out what are the feedback mechanisms on the things that are a little bit slower. And then I wonder about, too, obsolescence. Systems go old, systems get old and break down. But what happens when the software also gets old? And how do we build out tolerances, or how do we think about upgrading? And I think as civil engineers, urban planners, urban designers, we've always been not so good at that. And how do we make sure that we get a plurality of voices into the room? What are we optimizing for? Do we just want more cars to move faster on the street? Or do we want a street that is all of the above, that it handles people on the sidewalks very well? And maybe it says, actually, right now, there's a lot of people who want to have a picnic or to be outside, which we saw a lot during the pandemic. Maybe the system knows and just says, we're going to reroute you dynamically. We're going to just turn up a bunch of red lights. You can't go into this area. Please go somewhere else, and create spaces for people. And I think that imagination is what's lacking. We're good at the incremental. We're bad at thinking of these bigger visions of what a city can be for people. But I think that's the fundamental part in the reconciliation of all these systems moving forward. And we learned so many lessons about the pandemic, about how people live and how people we are social creatures. We are social beings. We want to see each other. And to have that taken away a little bit has been hard. So now we recognize the importance of public space. How do we then support that with these technologies, with all the other demands of transportation and logistics and sustainability on top of it? I think that is for us that we have to collectively talk about. And the technology and the data can help us, because we can bring data to the table saying, indeed, it is possible, or indeed, that is a vision worth having.
Yes, I agree. And I understand that this concept of cognitive city, it seems to be a bit vague at the moment, but still it sort of gives this umbrella helicopter view. And probably, again, this connectivity via data and devices will help us. But another question, we have one question from the audience connected to, sort of connected to this. Well, nowadays, people are talking about not only Internet of Things, but also Internet of Bodies, and partly your project you presented. They also touch upon this topic. But at the moment, how do you see the, well, this is the question from our audience, so I'm basically quoting, how do you see the development of the processing of this amount of data? And do you see, even if it is possible at all, to actually create this sort of sophisticated and incredibly incredibly heavy in terms of data systems, so to analyze the cities and all the inhabitants as basically one system and one organism?
Yeah, it's happening in disparate ways. I think with the cell phone data, we're getting kind of the picture of movement. I don't know, every time I put up my hand, actually I wear a bio tracking smartwatch because I care about that. That's just kind of something I do. So I want to know my sleep, right? Like this is also providing a picture. But those systems are not connected. My mobility, which this is GPS enabled, but then my bodily functions, my whatever bodily performance is not connected for a variety of reasons, privacy and all of that. Increasingly, we're seeing also emotions being kind of captured. I think in a soft side of like Bhutan doing surveys of happiness in their country to the city of Seattle doing surveys. Camera technologies can be deployed to measure emotions. The problem for me is that they're almost exclusively being used for, can I sell you something? Versus actually where, to quote Marie Kondo, where does the cities maybe spark joy? Or where the places are people are happy? Or how is it supportive of making, being joyful? So we have these systems that are all disparate. I don't personally want maybe all of them together, but I think I could maybe, and I think this is where the imagination comes in. How do we begin to contribute the data in ways that are meaningful to us, right? Like, is there kind of a civic portfolio or a civic platform where you maybe contribute the data that you want to contribute in ways that matter to you? In ways that do protect anonymity and maybe privacy in different ways. But I think, we can begin to kind of share this in different ways that aren't just about maybe, a company giving you 5% off of whatever you're consuming.
Sure. Yeah.
But I do think that there is a reality that the data will increasingly come together. It's how do we do it? And the fundamental questions, going back to, who keeps it? Who's the trusted party, if there is any? Maybe it's an AI. How do we preserve your privacy in a way that you want it to be protected, right? You may say in some ways, I want to give everything. Some cases, I want to really maybe aggregate it. And there's differential kind of ways of looking at that. And then also, what's the win for all of us as well? What are the things that we're asking? I think we do want to make our communities better, and we're willing to give a little bit. We just want to make sure that the benefits outweigh the costs or the risks to folks. There's an interesting study, this is outside of my domain, a big project, because in the medical world, good data is hard to come by, like really representative good data globally, because we're all so different. People are so different. So there's a big project that's several companies, Google, Vanderbilt University as the host, many universities are part of it, many medical systems, and the US departments of health have created a project called All of Us to collect bio records, in anonymized ways, but to try to make it representative so that we can move health science forward in a way that actually reflects the diversity of humanity. Because, it's amazing. The best heart data that we have longitudinally is from one town in Massachusetts. Like literally globally, the I think it's Hopkinton Health Study.
That's amazing, yeah.
Generations, but it's one town that we know, like longitudinal data. How do we maybe do this at scale? And I think that is a model of like maybe us looking at how do we do a civic kind of approach to improve our cities.
Thank you, thank you. Yeah, and probably before I will move to the questions, because we actually are almost out of time.
Oh no.
Well, but yeah, maybe you can advise for our audience, for those who are interested and would like to pursue deeper understanding in the field. What would you suggest them to read or maybe to seek inspiration from?
Mhm. I mean, I you can find I think it's publicly available now. I going back to Holly White, the
Hmm.
person with the camera. I love that study, and the reason why I point to it all the time, because I think it, in non-technical ways, really introduces the importance of observation and data collection about our cities. So that study was called "The Life of Small Urban Spaces: The Public Life of the Public Life of Small Urban Spaces." William H. White. And I
Hmm.
believe that the Project for Public Spaces has made that data, that information and reports available. You can get it from your library. It's pretty common. So I encourage you to take a look at that. I think that there are a variety of different groups. I think looking at Barcelona as case studies, I think their smart cities hub is doing quite a bit. Amsterdam is also doing quite a bit through their kind of city science hub. Of course, like places that I work, you can check my work out. And there's a couple of writings and the Sensible City Lab as well. I think other kind of really great books to look at. I would actually encourage you to maybe start in like the domain that you care about. Stay outside of the technology first, and then
Hmm.
work your way in. Um, I don't want to scare everyone with like all the books that say like all the sad things, like the car that knew too much. Talk about kind of self-driving vehicles and the fears around that. Sorry, I'm gonna just look over at my bookshelf because I have that. Um, Actually, one of the authors that I have taken personal inspiration from, who uh, passed away a little bit too soon, but Bill Mitchell, who was at MIT, was kind of like one of the kind of first fathers around the idea of the smart city. It's an old idea now. How he looked at it, it was definitely kind of smart city 1.0. But I think some of the ways
Yeah,
that
but
he also was trained as an architect.
understandable. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And he was dean of the architecture school at UCLA for many years. Was from the UK, from Australia, um, and he just had a view and a poetic way of talking about cities, but then slowly over time through his writings, the overlay of technology over it. And I think that he, as kind of a father of the smart cities, I think is great. I also think on the flip side of urbanism, uh, Jane Jacobs, as a writer, as a scholar of cities, the life and death of great American cities, I think is still, I think especially for the Russians in the room, you'll read some things and you'll be like, oh, we've always had that. Like for instance, the importance of eyes on the street. Or as I say, also, coming from Asia, the importance of grandmothers and how they contribute, how people being on the street actually contribute to lively spaces that in some ways we've lost because we've handed it over to cars. But I think even that perspective, because then we can imagine the way that technology can be supportive of those visions.
Thank you for those advices. I believe they are all very diverse and they will give our audience this sort of perspective, at least,
Yeah.
to look at this topic from different perspectives. So, well, unfortunately, it's time to wrap up. Uh, Although we definitely could discuss this topic for and various cases for hours, and we
Yeah.
hadn't had chance to answer all the questions. But
Yeah.
again, thanks to our audience for joining us and asking questions. And Anthony, it was very insightful, very intriguing, interesting, and entertaining conversation. So thank you very much for
And thank
joining
you
us today.
for having me, and thank you to the audience for tolerating me as well.
I invite all the viewers to follow our series and have a look at the past events on YouTube. And so thank you all and see you soon.